It's a consequential week that we're back doing this again. For one thing, as we record this, yesterday was May 1st, which is everywhere in the world, I think, except the United States, virtually everywhere in the world, International Labor Day. Um, and it commemorates the Haymarket uprisings. And though that's my understanding, those who gave their lives for the cause of labor on that strike, but we being, having powerful conservative and business influence in this country, we picked no, another weekend altogether to avoid any association with the international labor movement. But yesterday, I've discovered that Mother Jones died about a 10-minute walk from where I live. So I went up there for a wreath laying, and somebody had beaten us to it with a wreath and celebrating International Workers' Day. And of course, the big news of this week, although it's being distorted grotesquely by the news media, is the uprising on campuses all across the country, the encampments, sit-ins, and other forms of protest. And to me, I would start out by saying, I like this confluence of Labor Day, the World Labor Day, and the student uprising, but because it seems to me that even though the students' issues are not per se labor ones, they are both historic, and they both represent historic challenges to the same kind of power. And I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Well, I was also stimulated, as you were, by the confluence of May Day and these events. But the way it gelled in my mind was the aha moment yesterday when two logics crisscrossed in my mind. And the first one is the fact that over the last 2 to 3 years, there has been more union and labor organizing on campuses in this country than ever in the history of the United States. Having been a professor as my main job all my life, I can tell you that in most of the places where I've been a professor, there either was no union for the professors or no union for the graduate students. And a bracket here. Most teaching in universities in this country is now done by graduate students who get a name called adjunct, but it is a mysterious craziness. They're basically graduate students, and the university takes advantage of the fact that they can give this a kind of an in-between status, pay these young people way less than they would have paid a regular tenured professor. I am literally the last generation where most of us were regular professors. We got our PhDs, we were hired as an assistant professor, and then went up the ladder to be a tenured professor. Nowadays, most graduate students do a lot of teaching as graduate students. It stretches out the time for completing a dissertation. It means they live on unspeakably poor wages, unable, if they were interested in getting married, unable, if they were interested in starting families, and so on. And it gives the employer the double power. Not only are you in a position to take away a job with all that means, but you're also in a position to give or not give the degree which the young person has probably borrowed tens of thousands of dollars to acquire. And I mean, it is a double jeopardy, a double dependency, a double subordination. And my guess is that there's going to be, I don't know how long it'll take, a coming together of graduate students particularly, who are very active in all of these university activities, that we've been watching around Gaza and Palestine and so on the one hand, and the organizers. First of all, it's many times the same individuals. So they combine in one head the navigation. They're going to understand, even if it hasn't occurred to them yet, that some of the tactics appropriate to one are applicable to the other. They're going to understand that some of the tactics, some of the organizational skills and urgencies that a labor union imposes by the very nature of what it is will be applicable with adjustments to what they're trying to do in terms of free speech and of shaping the government's policies. So I find all of that very exciting, very unusual, very different from the conditions we had around the Vietnam War, which is when I was in a parallel situation to this one. There was no unionization of academia at that time. There were no organizing drives going on. There were a few unions in the few places that had constructed them. New York City was one of those places, but in general, it was not doable. And where there were efforts, they didn't work. Faculty did not want to think of themselves as union people. That was something for truck drivers or for miners or for manufacturing assembly line workers, but not for us vaunted professors with our civilizing missions and all of the rest. The current crop of students is way better developed, way better prepared, has a different framework. The very energies that have led to successful organizing drives have taught these young people that they can, in fact, do this. And I think they're going to carry over that confidence into this political realm, and we're going to see spectacular comings together that we would not have expected, perhaps, based on earlier history.
What you're saying, Richard Wolff, touches on a number of important issues. I think one of them is I believe that a lot of the public doesn't understand the conditions under which so many people who are doing university teaching, college teaching these days struggle. I think of adjunct professors as kind of the Uber drivers of higher education, that there's been a kind of gig economy invasion of academia, and that you're expected to work for peanuts and you're not promised benefits or any kind of guarantee of prolonged employment or any of those things. Not just in my experience, not just for graduate students, but for postdoctoral people and so on. So I know people who struggle with their adjuncts at 2 or 3 different universities in the Bay Area or what have you, and they still can't make get a couple thousand from this one, but they still can't get by. And I think that speaks to, when you compare it to your experience as, let's say, as a grad student in the 60s, the difference then, to me, is one of class consciousness. That I think, in my sense, is that back in those days, those of us who were in college, bound for college, much less graduate work, were trained to program to believe that we were not workers, we were an elite of some kind, and to behave accordingly. Even if we were leftist radicals, there was this subtle undercurrent of thought, I think, going along with the general mood of the triumph of the perceived triumph of capitalism post World War II and so on, and the brighter future we were supposedly all expecting. So I think we have that change, but I also think your comments connecting, some people might say, well, yeah, okay, but so grad students are doing this teaching and underpaid. What's that got to do with Gaza? But to me, that speaks to the matrix of relationships and power that's being highlighted by all of this. The fact is that graduate students are in the position they're in because of the economic system and the donors and so on, everything that structures the university. And these Gaza encampments aren't just protesting the genocide, they're protesting their own universities' participation in the genocide. So they're talking about divestment. Some of them are talking about if you're doing weapons research, you have to stop and so on. So to me, there is the potential, even if it hasn't occurred yet, that gradually people are starting to see the outline of an overarching system that they're struggling against in what may seem like unconnected struggles. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, and that's my hope, that they'll see all of those connections. I like that you brought it up. Let me say a word more about the adjunct, because this is really similar, and it's gelling in my mind because of what you just said. We have a sea change in higher education. When I went to colleges and universities, my professors were professors full-time. They didn't teach that many courses because it was understood they were to be the readers of every book in the field that came out. They were to be masters of the literature of each division or subdivision of a discipline. They were to be, the masters of the knowledge area. And they couldn't possibly do that if they were teaching 2 courses at the community college in the next town over, and then 3 nighttime courses at the school, because that would exhaust them, that would distract them, it's a completely different thing. So I remember there was a time when we would have meetings in the faculties that I was a part of. I don't mind mentioning Yale University, City University of New York, University of Massachusetts. These were places that I participated as a regular tenured faculty person, where we discussed the appropriateness or not of asking graduate students to do anything in the teaching area, whether that was not a dereliction of our duty, whether that was not depriving the students of what it was they had come to college to get. And we also worried that it was a bad thing for the graduate student, because he or she would spend time preparing the classes, grading the exams, meeting the student, doing the work we would normally do, which meant they could not give themselves to the study or the preparation of a doctoral research program that they were committed to. And that therefore it was and we didn't do it for years. We either didn't do it at all or did it on a very, very minimally constrained basis. Over the last 25 years, however, we were outmaneuvered by the university system, so that now at every one of these institutions, a huge number, in many cases a majority, of undergraduate courses are taught by graduate students who are in fact delaying completion of their own studies, their own dissertations, who are in fact substituting a much less developed mastery of the material than a senior professor could have or would have. And it's crystal clear to me why. It's cheaper. Universities can be more profitable institutions. And by the way, no one should be misled by the name nonprofit. Nonprofit doesn't mean that. Nonprofit is a fancy way of saying tax exempt. That's what these institutions are. They are not prohibited from making profit. They do make a regular profit. With 1 year exceptions, all of the 30 years I spent in and around Yale University, where I studied its books, they were profitable as a university, which they intended and sought to do. So this is a way for them to have become more profitable, all of these institutions. It allows the government to give them less money, so it doesn't have to tax the rich to raise the money to sustain public higher education. I want to remind everyone, 3/4 of our university and college graduates in the United States are graduates of public institutions. So we as the public have let our people down. And I think there's a growing awareness among students that they have been shortchanged in this way, that financial considerations were put at the top of the list by universities, usually dominated by business people sitting on the board of directors anyway, and that they have been made more businesslike at their expense. And there's the link, that the very same people that have decided that American foreign policy has to be a cheerleading program for Israel are the people who have done all of this stuff. Of course, they will repress criticism. They too have an inkling, even if they couldn't put it in words, of where that criticism might lead these young people to say, wait a minute, the same logic, the same mentality is afoot in all of these terrible, terrible decisions. I mean, the same faculty would sit around bemoaning the quality of our students. They weren't writing the way they once did. They weren't studying the way they once did. They weren't disciplined. Endless grousing among the faculty as if they were only spectators of some development that happened elsewhere by other people, carefully avoiding their own responsibility for having contributed to the very same procedure, having been silent as they watched their own administrators go down that road. And, fighting only to have less of it done to their department than some other department across the campus. I mean, it's pathetic, and it will be one day recognized. But this kind of student awakening on an issue, in this case, that happens to be far away, will lead students to see the connections. And again, my confidence, that is what happened with Vietnam. The opening months of anti-war activity were only that. But before long, there were connections between the anti-war and SDS, if I can remind people, that was busy in ghetto areas of American cities. And they talked about the university as being an oppressor of those poor neighborhoods.
Right, Morningside Heights. People
Yes.
forget that the first Columbia occupation was not just about the Vietnam War, it was also about the university's predatory relationship with lower income Black neighborhoods that it was trying to move into and acquire. And the students actually, as I recall, won some concessions on that. And I was going back and rereading, it's ironic that Columbia's administration is having these students arrested and roughed up and so on, because their website at Columbia University celebrates their history of student rebellion.
Yes.
And, it kind of tries to make a theme park out of it. And I read Richard Hofstadter's a graduation address that year, and Hofstadter was very much a historian, was very much an establishment figure when it came to his relationship with Columbia, and we could talk about some of his ideas too, but that's a different conversation. Even he was forced to concede how many good points the students had, and so it seems to me that we're up against that now, whether it's in terms of the big billionaire donors and their relationship to academic and other decisions, to the relationship to the military industrial complex on campus and the things it's funding, and to the class system on campus, which I think is more pronounced than it was 50 years ago in terms of, well, if you're a star professor, I mean, I don't mean to pick on Judith Butler because I think she's fine, but if you're Judith Butler or somebody with an equivalent reputation, you'll get very well paid. If you're somebody who's just doing the work in another field, not well known, you won't get that kind of pay. if you're a grad student, you're definitely the underclass. Administrators make a fortune. So all of it is intersecting to me in a very interesting way.
Yeah, I think, and people are going to notice parallels. Way back when, in the early days of the Columbia struggle, they fought against what I think came to be known as gentrification of those neighborhoods. And that has happened at Yale around it. I know that because I got my PhD at Yale and I taught there for a while. And it has happened at many universities. And that's not so different from what is going on in Gaza. Think a minute. You're trying to get rid of a local, poor, indigenous, been there a long time population. You're doing it, they didn't drop bombs in Morningside Park, but in terms of driving out poor people by gentrifying the neighborhood, that has been ongoing in New York City before, during, and since the Columbia events. And you have successfully driven thousands of families to suffer all kinds of difficulties to aggrandize a very wealthy university. That's the truth of it. And it's the truth of it at Yale and at Harvard and at Columbia and many, many, many other places. And that's not so different, not as violent, obviously, but not so different from the push inside Israel to make a greater Israel at the expense of Gaza and maybe the West Bank as well. We'll see in terms of how that goes. So the overlaps are everywhere. They're literally everywhere. I want to say something also about free speech and police. I find this amnesia of the ruling class in the United States remarkable. And here's what I mean. If you take seriously free speech, then the only function of the police is to ensure the freedom of speech. In other words, everybody has the right to say whatever they want. If there is an endangerment by one person who is maybe speaking to another who is maybe listening, or vice versa, the function of the police is to arrive and make sure that the free speech continues without a disruption thereof. Nobody can shut down the other one. So the police come. They have training for that. The police stand between the crowd that is for something and the crowd that is against it. They can yell at each other and all that. But if they get too close, the job of the police person is to say, come on, stay over there. You can say what you want. You can hold up your sign. You can have your speech making, but, respect physical safety. The police know how to do that. They do it all the time. They do it whether the contending parties are enthusiasts of one or another sports team, or they are enthusiasts or enemies of one or another celebrity personality. They do it outside when Mr. Trump is on trial to keep his supporters and his opponents safe from one another, but each of them is allowed to make their speech. What is this with the students? A student who says, I am made unhappy by the other person's speech, the response of the United States has always been, that's too bad for you. But we're not going to abridge another person's freedom to speak because it upsets you. On that basis, everybody's free speech would be shut down by the arrival of someone who says this. We can't do that. We don't allow people to go through intersections if they violate the red light and the green light, because it would kill us, and it would kill us. So to say that somehow the president of Colombia has the authority to bring the police in to shut down an exercise of free speech, that's an amazing departure from any norm that used to be at least verbally adhered to. I know it has happened umpteen times, but it needs to be called out, as it usually is by somebody, who says, wait a minute, what are you doing? And it's only slightly less absurd to actually hear a mayor of New York who is straight out despicable, but he's not only despicable on this issue, he's very convenient. He's despicable across all issues.
He's consistent. Yeah.
I mean, he's really,
Yeah.
it's extraordinary. But that aside, officials at Columbia spoke about real estate. I kid you not. These are adults with a reasonable education. The police were called in because Columbia owns the land upon which encampments were established. Really? You want to prevent free speech on one of the great issues agitating the world today on grounds of real estate? You've got to be kidding. Or you're so out of touch that you're not kidding, that you actually think this way. And I'm reminded of that by the sheer absurdity of valuing real estate over free expression of students at a university there to learn.
This is a time-honored trick of the current system. I'm thinking, I wrote about this. I didn't see anybody else catch it, but during the Occupy Wall Street movement,
same thing.
They talked about cleaning out protesters in Zuccotti Park. Now, Zuccotti Park had been Liberty Square or something. I think it was Liberty Square Park, but as part of a deal with realtors, the Bloomberg or Koch administration, I can't remember which one, made a deal. You can build your skyscraper that will overlook this area, but you have to keep it available to the public, just like it was before. And they said, okay, they signed that agreement. But they renamed it Zuccotti Park because I think Zuccotti was the shyster who put the whole deal together. So it's Zuccotti Park now. The protesters put up a library of movement materials that anyone can read. They come and they destroy the library and they kick out the protesters because they say you're on private property.
Yeah.
So this is, and that's what Columbia is doing. So the free expression of thought is openly subordinated to a sort of almost lordly, it's like a throwback to the English Civil War or something. I mean, right? It's just property versus human freedom. It couldn't be starker to me.
No, and it shows you how desperate they are. They are desperate to come up with whatever bullshit, if you pardon me, they can think of in that moment, because they just want this to stop. And all of the veneer, if Marx were alive, he would have a lovely line. All of the veneer of bourgeois society, all of that speechifying around graduation about civilization and its values of free inquiry and the students wanting to get together to learn and pass on the achievements of all of that is gone, and we call the police because they have a tent on our lawn. I mean, let me add something. I don't know the finances of Columbia, but I do know the finances of Yale University, and they're very similar. And let me inform everybody who might be interested. If you take a look at universities in America, private universities like Columbia or Yale and others, if you look at their financial statements, which I have done for Yale for 50 years, you will very quickly discover that they are private only in the imaginations of their owners and leaders and the people they can persuade to think like that. If you understand where their money comes from, these are public institutions. Let me explain. Number one, the single largest source of money flowing into Yale University each year of either all or most of the last 50 years has been government money funding research and programs at the university. Here's how it works. A professor like me at Yale, like me, organizes a research program, as I did and as my colleagues did, and we put together a budget, we will need $200,000 to hire graduate students. We will need $300,000 for travel to wherever the research requires. And it adds it all up, it's $2,400,000. We then apply to the Department of Energy or the Department of Defense or the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for a grant to do the research. If we get the grant, and since we're at a fancy private university, the odds are we will, as it happened to me repeatedly, then here's what people need to understand. The university puts a markup. If the program costs $2.5 million, the university at Yale would add another in the neighborhood of 60%, maybe more, would be. You know what that's for? Maintenance and general upkeep of the university as the host institution. There's where the money for the university comes from.
Right.
It's the taxpayer. Here's the second one. Gifts of wealthy donors.
Right.
In order to get that gift to the university, the government forgoes taxing the donor
Right.
by that amount. In other words, the government is subsidizing. Let me assure you that those donors would be giving Yale that money if they didn't get the tax write-off. I know that from personal experience. Crystal clear. Now, I could go on because there are other benefits, but these two alone are enormous. Columbia wouldn't be the institution it is if it hasn't been able to rip off the government in these ways for many, many years. And it's true of Yale, and it's true of Harvard, it's true of MIT, and I could go on. These are, in fact, at very least, quasi-public institutions. They depend on the public money, they depend on the taxpayer. Making the claim, we don't have to be available to the public because we're private, even more odious than it would have been just on the grounds you brought up, that if we weigh real estate against free speech, do we really want to come down on the power of real estate? No one is questioning that Columbia has that land. No one is questioning that when the demonstration is over, and since we're close to the summer vacation, that's going to be real soon, that it will revert to. Did not all the land that Occupy and that previous generations of demonstrators at all these universities presided over, did it not all revert to them? Yes, it all did. I mean, there's nothing here but desperate administrators frightened by something they could not prevent, frightened by something they seem unable to control, and turning, as they always do, to the armed goons that they can bring to bear into this situation. Shame on Columbia, shame on the police. There were some police people, to their credit, who made it clear after the first time Columbia brought them in that they didn't know why they were called. There was no violence, there was no danger, nobody was threatening anybody, and they didn't understand why they were there until the mayor and the police chief frightened them into coming up with a more acceptable statement, but they didn't understand, given that there's a city that needs them, why they were on this campus that clearly didn't.
And of course, the mayors, the police chiefs, the administrators are all responding to political leadership at the highest levels. Only a couple more things because we're running out of time. But one is, this has been a hobby horse of mine for a long time, these tax breaks. I remember when your colleague, Larry Summers, was responsible for, as president of Harvard, for the Harvard endowment. It was about $1 billion. I think it was $1.5 billion or so before Summers started managing, but I think it was about $1 billion when he got done with it. And I remember thinking, well, at a 35% tax rate, $350 million of that money is public money. and yet we have no say in how it's used. You talk about a Columbia where, let's say, or any other university where a Bill Ackman or some other hedge funder has given $1 billion, which means $350 million of public money. And yet he gets to decide what the university does and doesn't say. He gets to decide which students are going to be doxxed and exposed and have their careers ruined because of his petty prejudices and ignorance. And this is the system, the matrix of forces that we're supposed to be defending. I don't think so. So you have any last words before we go? I just hope this all
No,
becomes clearer and clearer.
Look, I think we are at a key point. The May Day we just celebrated has been noted in all the speeches that were made, my own included, that we are in a different place. The labor movement isn't the sad, declining, half-dead corpse it was until recently. It's percolating. The win of the UAW in Chattanooga, the drives in Amazon and Starbucks, and all the movement of the labor workers are on the march. Labor is in, and now we are in the same May Day, and at the time of May Day, learning that it's not just the workers that are moving, the students, who are often the first, are now beginning to show comparable movement. And to the folks at the top, with a smile and a grin, I can only say, watch out.
Well, their desperation shows their fear.
Yeah.
And with that, Richard Wolff, again, a pleasure to talk to you. And again, thanks for coming on the program.
And my thanks to you for keeping this program going. It's a very important public service.
We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.